Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. Today's topic is Concept Note Training Guidance for NGOs. I am Anutma and I'm here to facilitate this session. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for taking out time from your busy schedules. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, which includes 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A option on your webinar screen to post your questions, and we will respond to them during the Q&A session. Let's begin with webinar's objective. The first objective is to gain greater understanding of the main components required in every concept note, be more confident in understanding what assessors look for when assessing applications, be better equipped to write a convincing narrative, have greater insight into the steps to follow when developing your application. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of Funds for NGOs premium website. And now allow me to introduce today's trainer, Cheryl Hooper. Cheryl is an experienced development consultant and CEO of an international charity. She is an expert trainer and has provided training and capacity building to support international NGOs for more than 20 years. Cheryl has a BA honors degree in sociology and a master's degree in international cooperation and humanitarian aid. She has successfully developed numerous award-winning programs and secured funding from US Aid, UK Aid, Comic Relief, and several high-profile grant-making trusts and foundations with a combined value in excess of $5 million US. She has been on the judging panel for the prestigious UK Charity Times Award for the past 3 years, a published author of a guide for NGOs in youth-led peer education, and was conferred a Women of the Decade Award by the Women's Economic Forum in October 2023. Now, I kindly request Cheryl to share the screen and lead the session.
Hello, everyone, and I hope that you've all had a very good weekend. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm sure you've all seen how obtaining grants from institutional donors has become more complicated and competitive. And so the more we're able to get into the head of the donor and understand what their thinking is, the better we are able to respond to questions posed in a grant application. So today, I want to share with you some of the experience I've gained over the years when writing and developing concept notes, and to really drill down into the different components that crop up in concept notes over and over again. So many of you will be familiar with the term concept note, and I'm sure there will be a lot of you who've tried to apply for funding, which for many big donors begins with a concept note. But before I begin looking at the detail, I just want to be clear about what a concept note is, because it's an easy mistake to make, or an assumption, that a concept note is just an idea. It's just an idea for a project. This can be the first mistake many NGOs make, and because of this, it can lack the detail required. A concept note is a first stage proposal and the most competitive stage of a call for proposals. So at this stage, assessors will weed out any application that doesn't meet the desired requirements or doesn't sufficiently explain the project in the way that is needed. Therefore, if you're planning to apply for funding that requires a concept note, make sure that you have a fully developed proposal and not just the framework for an idea. Some of the common misconceptions about concept notes are that they're a simple application, but even if the application or proposal is limited to 2 or 3 pages, it will require the necessary detail to make a good case for support. Also, if you're expected to write something in a limited space or word count, then it's even more important to really know your project so that you're able to cut out the waffle and concentrate on the details. Often with a concept note, a full budget isn't required, but you are expected to put in the total grant request. Therefore, even if you don't have to upload a full budget, you would need to develop the budget in order to know how much you need for the grant. This is why it's necessary to develop the full project as part of the application. So given the amount of time required to write a concept note, let's assume that you will be doing this on the basis that your project proposal is strong and that you meet all the necessary requirements. Therefore, when approaching the development of the application, you should at the same time make sure that you have all the various policies and financial systems in place to implement the project and manage the grant. If you go through to the second stage, then you would be expected to submit these as part of due diligence before any funding is awarded. So make sure you read the guidance carefully for the full or second stage proposal as well, and make sure that you have the relevant documentation required if your application is shortlisted to the final round. And this may require other things like audited accounts as well as policies and finance manuals. So the look and requirements of concept notes vary in their questions and expected format. However, there are some things that are common to all applications or proposals, and it's these that I want to point out to you. If the call is about something in particular, such as disability or gender or climate change, for example, then there may be further questions about specific priorities of the grant maker. And later in this training, I'm going to talk through these elements and some of the typical questions that would come up under these headings and show you how to tackle them. But this is the typical project components for a concept note. So we've gone through the different sections that will be in all concept note applications, but here are the other things that are likely to be expected in your responses. They may be referred to in the guidance notes, but even if the donor doesn't explicitly ask for these, I would think about how and what you can include with these above elements in your responses. So added value. What do we mean by this? Well, this could be the use of volunteers, which might be cost saving, for example. Innovation could be how your project is bringing a fresh approach to tackling certain development challenges. Sustainability needs to be clearly thought through so that you're able to explain what plans you have to continue the work after the grant ends. And diversity should demonstrate how the project has been designed to be fully inclusive. So when assessing a project application, assessors are faced with hundreds of proposals, and most of them will be well-deserving projects. But of course, they must make a decision on which ones to take through to the second stage and which ones to reject. So when faced with such a decision, Often it's not just the project idea, but more about how the project is designed, that the thinking and the rationale behind it is clear and easy to understand, and that there is evidence to prove the need for the work, and that the planned outcomes are achievable, and that the NGO has the ability to deliver what it promises. These are things that will affect an assessor's view of your application and not just a brilliant idea. So the questions that I'm going to talk through now have been directly taken from a concept note application from a call for proposals from an institutional donor. So what I've done is I've taken a past call for proposals and I'm going to go through the questions there for you. So here you will see that the first question is asking for information about your NGO. And because this particular call is about disability, the donor also wants to understand what experience you have in the disability sector. So here you want to focus on three things. One is to keep the response brief. Remember, they've only allocated half a page for this. Two is your experience as an NGO. So this would be your experience in general in community development, in managing grants, in achieving impact, and so on. And then three is experience in disability. So I wanted to point this out to you so that if you're presented with a question like this, it would be easy to just focus on your experience in the disability sector. But if you are an NGO that works outside this sector, but you adopt an inclusive approach to your programs, so you're not necessarily a disability-focused NGO, but you meet the criteria the donor is looking for, then you could still apply for this, but you would need to describe your inclusive approach and other achievements and skills within the organisation. So in question 2, you can see that the donor has several things within one section that need to be addressed. So it's important that you break this section down and make sure that you answer each point. Firstly, there is a need for a brief project summary. Think about this and the key words used, such as what is the project? What are you trying to do? So for example, this is a 3-year project that addresses the growing problem of food insecurity and malnutrition in Somalia. Who, another key word. The project reaches 500 pregnant and lactating mothers and 1,000 children and babies under 10. Another key word, why. Severe drought caused by adverse climate change, deep-rooted poverty and ongoing conflict has contributed to crop failures, etc. And then explain the other keywords, when and where. After this, you can explain long-term vision and impact that will result, the project objectives, outputs or activities and outcomes. But be guided by the amount of space the donor has allocated for this. So here you will see they've allowed 2 pages, so they would be expecting a certain level of detail in this section. So you can start with the project summary and vision. So, repeat the project summary. There's usually a section at the beginning of a concept note that will give the project summary, but you can again explain it at the beginning of this section. But the important thing to stress is that your answer should be written in a logical format, beginning with the project summary and the end goal, and then the outcomes that will result, which focus on the changes the project will make in the short and medium term, and then the final impact. Then follow through with your project objectives And when developing the project objectives, think of them as taking you along a pathway that leads you to the end goal. So take each objective and really question, is this objective leading us forward to achieving that end goal? After this, you can describe the deliverables. And so these are the summary of changes that your project will deliver, the number of beneficiaries reached, and so on. And then, of course, an explanation on the geographical location and context of the work. So in question 3, there is a separate section that asks you to justify the need for the project, but also justify the approach you are taking. So be careful that you answer both elements. So begin with the overarching need for the project. Here you should explain the context of the work and what is the problem that your project is addressing. Why does the problem exist and what difference will your project make? Then you need to explain why you have chosen the approach or the methodology described. So, for example, if you're focusing on a rights-based approach or a youth-led approach or a community participatory approach, for example, why have you chosen that way to achieve your end goal and how can you justify this? So this might be something like explaining that you have already visited the community and carried out a consultation with beneficiaries on the proposed methodology or approach. So the question specifically asks for an explanation about why you need to carry out each activity. And so again, it's important that you explain this in your answer. So with that question, as I said, there's only one question, but within it, there are several components to it. And a classic mistake for NGOs when they write a concept note or an application is they only answer part of the question. And so make sure that you answer each of the points raised in that question. So look at the question and break it down by the key words. So this stops you from waffling and it really helps you to make sure that you have addressed all of the key points. So what I do is I usually just get a highlight pen and I just highlight the key words in that section. And then I go back, I write my answer and a response, and I check that my answer actually responds to each area that we have the donor has asked for. And then, of course, proof it and edit it, because quite often you will be asked to stick to a particular word count. And so this is where you can go back and make sure that you get it into the right word count. And for some of you, if you have actually written this section already, and say it's a word count of 500 words, and say you have managed to get this answer as best you can, and you know that it's responding to each section of that paragraph that they ask you, but your word count is 520 words, and you are really struggling to get it into 500 words. This is where you could go into an AI application, put your answer into an AI application and say, edit this response to 500 words without losing any of the detail. And usually what you will find is the AI application will be able to get that down to the required word limit. But then what you would need to do is double check that response to make sure that you're happy with it and it hasn't lost any of the detail that you put forward. So question 4. So it's important here to make sure that you understand the priorities of the donor. So basically, this is a USAID concept note, call for proposals. And it's really important that you understand what are the priorities of this donor and what does it want to achieve with regard to improving the rights of people living with a disability. It also wants to make sure that any project it funds also reflects the provisions of the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. And so your answer needs to respond to that, and you need to be clear on both those things and demonstrate that clearly in your proposal and how your project reflects this. So again, it's about making sure that you answer both areas in the question. You don't just refer to USAID's priorities, or you only refer to the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. You need to make sure that you answer both points when you answer that section. So if you have several activities, so here it's asking you to list the main activities, remember, that's your key word, with target dates for completion. So if you have several activities, it's possible you could put them under different headings and explain the target dates and duration to save space rather than list each individual activity. So, for example, one heading might be training in basic rights, but within the scope of the project, this may include several different training sessions. So rather than list each one, you could put the main heading and then list the different components or sessions. So here, this question is about staff and how many people will be directly involved or funded by this project. So this is linking, this section is linked to the budget. So the donor isn't expecting a huge amount of detail here, as this section has been allocated half a page, but it does want sufficient explanation that whoever is involved in implementing the project has the right level of experience and that the different roles are directly relevant to the grant request. So in other words, it's expecting to get a picture of the key workers. So again, you can begin this section with an opening paragraph that clearly explains the summary of staffing, and then you can go into the detail of the specific roles after that. So here, this is just a question about collaboration. So really, they just want to know, are you going to be partnering with anyone else in this project? So if you're not partnering with anyone, don't just put no in this section. They've allowed half a page here. So if you're not collaborating or you're not partnering with anyone, that's absolutely fine, but explain why. So explain why you don't feel the need to collaborate and why the project has been designed in the way that you are able to implement as on your own. And then likewise, if you do plan to collaborate, explain why you are partnering and how that partnership will enhance your outcomes. So in this particular concept note, there is a requirement to provide a budget, but there are many calls for proposals that don't expect a full and detailed budget, but rather they want a total budget figure as part of the application. So of course, if that was the case, you wouldn't be able to do that without developing a full budget. So whether you are asked for a full budget or not, it's advisable that you develop a full budget even at the concept note stage, even if you're not required to submit it. Because if you get through to the next stage, then you will have already done most of the work. And so it is time well spent. And also it really helps you to think through the logistics of the project and the budget implications. And so it's a good exercise to do that. So the section about M&E has been allocated to one page here. And so here, the assessor wants to understand how you would go about the monitoring and evaluation aspect of the project, but not necessarily know every aspect, because it's likely that if you go through to the next stage, a full and detailed M&E plan would be expected as part of the documents you need to upload. So at this stage, the donor wants to understand how you would monitor and evaluate the changes taking place. And so they're looking for clarity in your thinking and what indicators you would put forward, so that that the indicators you put forward and you develop make sense. So here, this is kind of like, think of it like an outline monitoring and evaluation plan. And again, it's something that is a useful exercise for you to do, so that when you go to develop the full M&E plan, a lot of the basic thinking has already been thought through. So let's take a look at the section about your ability to deliver and how you might address this. So in a concept note application, this section may ask about your NGO's experience or background. What this is really about is providing reassurance to the assessor that your NGO has the resources, the skills, and the experience to deliver the project and the planned outcomes. So don't just focus on the history of your NGO, but demonstrate your skills and experience by referencing other donors who have funded you, other projects you have managed. Prove that you have appropriate systems in place to manage finances and reduce risk. Demonstrate that you have appropriate policies in place for safeguarding vulnerable adults, and that you have the ability to manage the grant. So I've already touched upon the project summary element of a concept note, and you should be prepared that there will always be a project summary in a concept note, whether this is an application form or written proposal. So this is an important and crucial element of the concept note. So take time to get it right and practice writing it before you arrive at the final version. So this needs to be a paragraph that succinctly explains what is the problem that the project is addressing, who is affected by that problem, and how many people will benefit from the project. How is the project resolving the problem, and where is it located? So the project summary is the first thing that the assessor is likely to read. So make sure that it grabs attention and that it's a strong statement of intent. Make it inspiring and strong to encourage the assessor to want to know more. So try practicing this and writing and refining it until you are satisfied that it clearly explains the project in a few sentences. There'll always be a section in a concept note that asks about the context of the work and why the project is needed. So this may be a direct question, or it could be a few sentences with more than one question that probes a number of issues. For example, typically it could be, explain why the project is needed and why you are the best organisation to deliver the project. So here there are two things to address. One is why the project is needed, and secondly is why your NGO is best placed to deliver it. It's important to answer both things and not just focus on the first bit about why the project is needed. So often funders are looking to see how well you know and understand local issues. So whilst it's important to describe the wider situation and use evidence and data to back this up, because the wider picture often affects local issues, but then make sure that you concentrate on the local area where the project is to take place, and then back up anything you write with relevant data and facts and link this back to the problem that you are addressing. So when writing the concept note, be clear on the planned outcomes and impact that will result because of your project. Sometimes it's easy to fall into jargon or technical terms, but it's important that when you design your project, that you're clear on the difference. So I've given some examples in the slide to explain the difference. So when we talk about impact, think about long-term change. So these are things like, for example, strengthened social capital or stronger communities, so that in the long term, because of the various interventions, there is a reduction in poverty, people have a better quality of life, and in this example, more girls complete education and have better educational outcomes. So these are all examples of long-term change and the impact of a project. Whereas the outcomes are about short to medium change. So examples of outcomes might be more tangible things like safe spaces for girls would be created. Entrepreneurship training will be available. Homework clubs will be available after school. So all these things would perhaps not have been in place before the project, but as a result of the interventions, they are in place and are making a difference in the short to medium term. So you would be expected to provide an overview of monitoring and evaluation. As I said earlier, in the example I gave you, they were only looking for one page on M&E. So you would be expected to provide an overview of monitoring and evaluation and how you would track and assess the progress of the project. And crucially, how you would evaluate whether the interventions are working. So remember that monitoring focuses on monitoring and tracking progress of activities against the work plan and to check that you are moving forward in the right direction. But evaluating is about learning. It's about learning from the data and the stories that are collected. So to strengthen your application, consider not only what needs to be monitored, but what data needs to be collected and for what purpose. There's no point in collecting data for the sake of it. An assessor would want to know, what are you going to do with that data and how would this help to evaluate the impact of the project? So whatever activities you implement, make sure that they contribute to the objectives of the project and that these will eventually lead to the planned outcomes and impact. So really make sure that your activities are relevant and you're not really question again that your activities are relevant to the objectives and that your objectives are taking you forward along the pathway to achieve your end goal. So always make sure that each element of your concept note and project design makes sense. So it's very easy to write a project proposal, but then not really have the time to stand back and look at it objectively and think, actually, is this logical? Have we developed this in a logical way? So when you list the activities you're planning to implement, an assessor will want to consider how relevant those proposed activities are and if they will lead to the planned outcomes. They'll also think about the duration of the project and if the activities you propose are realistic and feasible. They will consider the methodology you propose and how effective this will be. And then finally, if you are adding value, for example, training local people to be trainers, so that you're putting in place sustainable ways for the project to continue beyond the grant period. So beneficiary numbers are important in a concept note application, but the number of beneficiaries you aim to reach should be realistic and in line with the capacity of your NGO, the resources that you have and the staff that you have, and of course your geographical reach. So for a small NGO, for example, if you propose to reach 10,000 individuals across a big geographical area, the assessor may question whether your NGO has the capability and resources to achieve this. So know your beneficiary group and be realistic in the number of people you believe your project can support. Because sometimes this can be the difference between a successful and unsuccessful application. So there's likely to be a section in all concept notes which wants information on who the project is supporting and why they need support. So when you say how many people in your project will reach, assessors will want to consider if the number of beneficiaries is realistic based on the scope of work and the budget, and that you have a clear understanding of the profile of your beneficiary group and why they need support. And also that the project you are proposing leaves no one behind and addresses all members of the community. So there'll always be a section on M&E, and whilst at the concept note stage you may not be expected to go into the detail, as I've said before, you should always consider this carefully and make sure that you allocate sufficient funds in the budget. Assessors will want to know not only what you are monitoring, but why. There's no point in monitoring activities for the sake of it. Monitoring is an activity that has to be linked to the planned outcomes. So while always try and adopt joined up thinking with all aspects of developing your project. So you should include a baseline assessment as part of the M&E section in a concept note, because the baseline is how you will measure change and if the project has made a difference. If you don't know where the starting point is, it would be very difficult to assess the effectiveness of any interventions you implement, and an assessor would expect this. However, try and think about the change your project is trying to make so that you know which area to focus your baseline on. So, for example, if your project is about access to education for disadvantaged girls, then your baseline would need to include the current situation about the enrolment of girls in school in your project area, the current dropout rate, and the completion of girls completing education, and so on. Measuring change is the main way to assess if a project has been successful. So when you are working with local communities, Behaviour change can be hard to define and measure, but ways that you could do this could be through qualitative information gathered through surveys, interviews, focus groups, personal stories, and so on. And then this could be backed up with hard data and facts. So when you begin writing your concept note, begin with the intention of going through to the final stage of assessment. Don't just try it and think, oh, let's just see where we go. Really believe, develop the program as if it's a full program. This puts you in a positive frame of mind, but also helps you to understand from the outset that you need to have a fully thought through project which follows the steps I've detailed in this diagram. So whilst you may not have all the details you need at the concept note stage, you should have enough understanding of the need for the project with evidence to prove this. You should have thought through the outcomes and anticipated impact based on a situational analysis. And then you should be confident that the methodology and activities you're proposing will be accepted locally, and that you have carried out consultation to know that the project is wanted by local communities. Once you have all this information and you're confident that your project is required and will make a difference, you can work out the practical elements of the implementation with regard to what sort of resources you might need, how will activities be delivered, and where and how much will this cost. So as part of the consultation locally, it would also strengthen your proposal to ask how the project could be continued beyond the grant period. This will show an assessor that you have considered sustainability and that your project doesn't plan to end just because the grant has finished. And then finally, you should think about how change would be measured and what you need to do to evaluate the impact of the project. So think about tackling a concept note in three stages. So the first stage is the project idea, and behind this should be thorough preparation, fact-finding, and consultation. Then stage 2, when your project is defined and you have clear outcomes and impact, you need to focus on how you will monitor the project and evaluate whether interventions have worked and how the project will continue after the funding has ended. And then stage 3 is to consider the cost of delivering the project and what resources would be needed. And so just a few final tips, as I said, to make your application stand out. So a donor may not necessarily put this in their guidance, but always think about ways that you can add value to the proposal and to the programme to improve the impact of the work. How you would sustain the work beyond the grant period, and then also innovation. What can you do that is really demonstrating new ways to tackle ongoing development challenges? And those are 3 key areas that even if a donor hasn't put that into their guidance, they will be looking for that in every application that they assess. So thank you so much for participating today. I really value your feedback, and I hope that this training webinar will give you more confidence the next time you see an open call for proposals and concept notes. I hope that it will give you a good basis to approach writing and developing a concept note. I'm sure there are questions following this, as I've given you a lot of information today. And so I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your presentation. Participants, now we have started Q&A session. Please send in your questions. The first question is, if my non-profit is newly founded, that is, it has never had a funder. Now, how do we handle our experience and previous projects to illustrate our expertise?
Okay. I mean, I think that's a very good question, because there's always small and newly formed NGOs that struggle with that element. Okay. So one thing I would say is that you can draw upon the impact of your work. Okay. So I think it's important, if you're a new NGO and you are working in the community, begin to collect evidence of the difference that you are making on different levels. So collect data in terms of numbers, in terms of how many people you are supporting, the difference that you are making. Collect personal stories as well. But also what you can do is you can refer to the expertise and skills within your implementing team. So you can talk about your lived experience in the community, the number of years that you have been in that community. Some NGOs are founded by people with very diverse skills and connections. And so you can talk about that. So say, for example, if you've got qualifications, that are relevant, you could refer to that. But also the other thing that would really help new NGOs is if you had a steering committee and you invited some, if you're a community organisation, for example, you're struggling because you've not had that funding, and you don't necessarily you've got the expertise, but you feel like you could do with more kudos, if you like, then a good way to do that is to get a steering committee together. So that usually community NGOs are very embedded in the community and have very good networks. So you could draw upon certain people. They might be academics in universities, they might be business people, they might be community leaders, they may even be people involved with local government. And you can invite them to be part of a project steering group. And quite often when you ask people, you would be surprised that some people are very happy to get involved in something like that, and they would be very willing to support you because of the work that you're doing. So when you have a section like that in your project application, if you have a steering committee, you can then refer to people in that steering committee that would give you the recognition that you need. And then the other thing is, as I said to you in the training, is to make sure that you're not going for huge grants if you are newly formed. So if you're a new NGO and you see a funding opportunity and it's for several thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, I really don't think you're in the right place to be applying for those grants. You're much better off looking at smaller grants. Pick the low-hanging fruit first. So go for the smaller opportunities, and get those in, and then gradually build up in terms of how much funding you seek. So I hope that's helped.
Thank you for your response, Cheryl. The next question is, I want to know how different should the concept note be for a concept note that is not solicited?
Sorry, Annie, could you say that again? Are they saying, can they submit an unsolicited concept note?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I would say that most funders, if this webinar has really focused on responding to an open call for proposals. So it's very difficult. I know USAID do accept unsolicited concept notes, but actually finding out how to do it, they're very guarded in terms of trying to work out exactly which department you send it to. But if you decide that you are going to try and submit an unsolicited concept note, then I would just follow the guidance that I've put forward in terms of the headings and how to lay it out, and following the format that I have suggested. But mostly concept notes and applications are like this are usually responding to an advertised call for proposals.
Thank you for your input, Cheryl. The next question is, what is the appropriate number of pages for a concept note?
Well, again, I think that's a good question. So basically, there's different types, and according to and some donors change all the time. So, you might get, for example, I've seen USAID and the European Union, they'll put out a call for proposals, and then they have an application form. And in that application form, there will be a word count. So they'll have, and it will follow a format in much the same way as I've just gone through in this webinar. And there will be a word count under the different sections. And in other applications or calls for proposals, they've just asked for a call for proposals. Now, when I've done, just to give you an example, I did an application which was a concept note for, I think it might have been for the EU, and on first glance it looked like the application form was quite small, but by the time you'd filled in the different sections and they'd allowed half a page for this, 2 pages for this, 500 words for that, by the time that concept note had been finished, it was between 8 to 10 pages long. So I think with an application form, they can really vary. It's impossible for me to say. If you were just submitting a proposal without an application form to fill in, I would say it would be around 5 pages. Yeah, between 5 pages, something like that. I think if you were going on 3 pages, it wouldn't be detailed enough. So you don't want it overly detailed. It's a difficult one. You don't want it overly detailed, but you do want to put in sufficient information for them to really understand the project. So as I said, concept notes applications tend to be quite long by the time you've filled in all the various sections. If it's a straightforward written proposal, then I would say probably about 5 pages.
Thank you for your input, Cheryl. The next question is participant is saying, thank you for the great presentation. I've learned a lot. Kindly please tell, is theory of change necessary while writing a concept note?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one as well. So it can be, yes. I mean, quite often with calls for proposals, some donors would expect the theory of change to be explained in full in the second application, in the full proposal. But I think if you've got the space, then you could definitely refer to the theory of change if you have the space. I wouldn't put an explanation of the theory of change in if you are really limited on space. But you could have a very simple explanation. So if you think about it, a theory of change is a sort of hypothetical explanation. It's, we believe if this is the problem, and we believe if we do this, this change will occur. So that's what a theory of change is. And I think if you can explain that in your application without referring to the theory of change, if you think through the theory of change, you should be able to take out what you're trying to do and put that into a project application. So I don't think a theory of change is necessary in a concept note unless the funder has specifically asked for it, because quite often concept notes are limited in word and character counts, and they expect a lot of information in a short amount of space. And so my experience is that the theory of change comes in the second part, in the second stage application.
Thank you for your input, Cheryl. The next question is, how important is the inclusion of sustainability plans at the concept note stage?
Yeah, I would say that sustainability is crucial. So I think when you develop your project, always think right from the very start, how are we going to sustain this beyond the grant? Okay, so you may not need to put in a sustainability plan, okay, because again, in the concept note, there's a chance that you simply won't have the space to do it. But you must refer to sustainability and show that you have a plan in place. So, some of the activities that you develop, and some of your objectives should refer to ways to sustain the project. Okay, so when you're developing your project objectives, remember what I said about think about each project objective as a taking you along a path, that's taking you forward to that end goal. That's what you're trying to do with those project objectives. Okay, so you need to question whether your project objectives are relevant. Okay, but one of those project objectives has to be about sustainability, because if you don't include it, how are you going to sustain the project beyond the grant? So you won't necessarily need to put in a sustainability plan with that level of detail, but you do need to show that you have thought about it and that you've included ways to sustain it.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your input. Participants, due to time limitations, we cannot cover all the questions posted here. As now we have reached the end of the webinar, I want to thank each one of you for your active participation And we would also like to thank you, Cheryl, on the behalf of the entire team. Participants, please take a moment to fill out feedback form for today's session. Your input is crucial in helping us to improve. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforNGOs.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen in a moment. Once again, thank you everyone, and to all the participants, we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.